Welcome back to Accounting Matters. I'm Adam Olsen, Embark's National Head of Practices. And in our last GRC episode, I talked with Allison Bradshaw, who leads our GRC services at the firm, about the return of investment of internal audit and when to consider both outsourcing versus co-sourcing. Today, however, we're going to tackle GRC modernization, how organizations build governance, risk, and compliance functions that are ready for the future. Allison, welcome back.
Thanks, Adam. Great to be here again.
Yeah, so Allison, this is one of the most important conversations I think a lot of CFOs need to be having right now, right? Most organizations, when they think about their GRC functions, they were built 10, 15, maybe even longer ago in response to SOX or maybe some other specific risk that they were facing. Fast forward to today, right? The world has changed dramatically, but I think a lot of functions at most organizations haven't always kept pace. And I'm seeing CFOs frustrated because they know that that GRC function isn't working optimally, but they don't know how to fix it without massive disruption to the business.
Yeah, that's right. That's exactly what we're seeing. A lot of organizations really still exist in a world where governance, risk, and compliance are still operating all in their own silos with different teams, different IT systems, and different reports. Meanwhile, the risk landscape has completely shifted with the constant changes associated with cyber risks, sustainability risks, AI governance, and accelerating regulatory changes. The old siloed model isn't able to keep up.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly what we want to try to unpack some more today. How do you modernize GRC? What does an integrated technology-enabled function look like? And how do you really get there, right, without disrupting the day-to-day business?
Absolutely.
All right, so let's jump in, maybe just starting with the why, kind of the case for GRC modernization. So when you're talking to CFOs about modernizing their function, like what pain points of theirs kind of make that need urgent?
Yeah, so I think these pain points fall into a few categories. And first is inefficiency and duplication. So when governance, risk, and compliance operate in silos, there are multiple teams doing overlapping work. Using controls as an example, right? Internal audit will assess controls. Compliance will assess controls, and IT security will also assess controls as well, right? This usually happens with all three groups asking the same questions of the same people and for the same evidentiary support multiple times. For those who are working with them, it's exhausting and inefficient.
Yeah, and you'll hear controllers a lot of times use the term like audit fatigue, right? And I think here's what's interesting, right? This costs more than I think what a lot of companies may even realize. It's not just what's that direct kind of full-time equivalent cost of that person, but it's also the opportunity cost of what those leaders could be doing instead of like responding to all those requests that you just referenced in that example, right? It's the strategic risk of blind spots because information, frankly, just isn't flowing well at the organization. And I think those hidden costs sometimes can even be bigger than what are the most obvious and visible ones.
100%. So the second pain point is really lack of visibility and connectivity. When each function operates independently, no one really has a holistic view of the risk, right? So your CISO, for example, may know and understand your cyber risks. Compliance is going to understand and know the regulatory risks. Internal audit may know operational risks, but nobody's connecting the dots, right? A cybersecurity incident can quickly become a compliance issue, which can then also become a financial reporting issue as well.
Yeah, and I think, going back a few years, right, like we saw that during the pandemic, right? Organizations that had integrated risk management responded faster because they could kind of see those interconnections, supply chain disruptions that were affecting maybe the revenue recognition or remote working that was creating both the cyber and compliance risk simultaneously.
Perfect example, Adam. The third pain point is really outdated technology. So many organizations manage GRC activities in spreadsheets or disconnected kind of what I'll call first generation tools, right? As well as with just periodic assessments that really don't integrate. So another outdated concept in this category is really just the concept of manual data collection, testing, and reporting. All of this is really time consuming, error prone, and always backward looking, which is not ideal, right? As you're looking to use that information to make decisions and be responsive. And then finally, really, the talent and expertise needed for GRC these days really has shifted significantly from historical perspectives. Modern GRC needs people that understand data analytics, APIs, automation, and emerging risks like AI governance. That's really hard to find and, quite frankly, expensive to build internally.
Yeah, so inefficiency, lack of visibility, the technology debt, like talent gaps, I think that's compelling. but I would imagine there's also resistance. And I'll be honest, there's probably organizational inertia. The people who built the current GRC function probably often have a vested interest in kind of maintaining what they built. Your chief audit executive maybe doesn't want to necessarily integrate with compliance fully because it means possibly giving up some of their autonomy. So how do you make the case to those people that maybe struggle with that resistance?
Yeah, so I think it typically comes down to three of the most important things there. First, cost avoidance, right? Are you able to integrate GRC functions to eliminate duplication, reduce burden on the business? We've seen organizations reduce total GRC costs by 20 to 30%. The second being risk mitigation and reduction. So obviously an integrated function catches issues earlier, makes better decisions, and avoids compliance failures. And then third and finally, and I think this one gets the most executive attention, is competitive advantage, right? Organizations with modern GRC move faster. They can launch products or services faster with more streamlined compliance. They can enter markets faster with a better understanding of the regulatory landscape, and they can adopt AI faster with governance frameworks in place. So with that being said, in that scenario, GRC really becomes an enabler to the business and not a constraint.
Yeah, I think that's a nice way to characterize that, right? GRC as an enabler rather than a constraint. And I think that's a fundamental shift, right? The best CFOs are positioning their teams as strategic partners, not just scorekeepers at the organization. They want to be in the room when decisions are made. GRC modernization can be part of that evolution. And I think if your GRC function provides rapid risk insights that help the business move faster, you're basically at the table, right? I guess on the contrary, if you're producing kind of that backward-looking information that you talked about earlier, reports that come 6 weeks after quarter close, then candidly, you're not.
Yeah, less and less relevant to the business, right? Backward historical information.
All right, well, let's pivot then to maybe talking about from your experience what an integrated GRC model looks like. So how does all of that, it's nice to say that, but how does it actually come together in
great
practice?
question. Let's start with the framework that most organizations use, which is the 3 lines of defense model, something I'm sure you're familiar with. But the first line of defense is really that operational management component, right? This is the business itself, the people who own and manage risk day to day. Frontline employees, business unit managers, and operational staff, those who are really responsible for identifying, assessing, and controlling risks within their areas. They implement internal controls, follow policies, and ensure compliance as part of their regular work. The second line of defense is your oversight function. And these usually sit alongside the first line of defense, but independent of it, right?
Okay.
These include dedicated risk management teams, compliance officers, related functions like information security or quality assurance. They set the frameworks, policies, and standards that the first line follows. They also monitor and challenge the first line's risk activities, providing guidance and reporting to senior management. And then finally, you have the third line of defense, which is internal audit. This is the most independent layer. Internal audit provides objective assurance to the board and senior management that the first and second lines are working effectively. They evaluate the overall adequacy of the governance, risk management, and control framework. Their independence, typically reporting to the board or audit committee or some other person charged with governance, is typically what gives their assessments the credibility needed to rely on, right? In traditional organizations, these 3 lines operate independently. The second line functions don't talk to each other. They have separate reporting, separate committees, and separate tools.
Yeah, which I imagine creates problems on problems on problems.
It absolutely creates blind spots. Let me give you kind of a real example there, Adam. We worked with a financial services company where the compliance team was tracking regulatory changes. The legal team was tracking litigation risks. The IT team was tracking cyber risks. And the risk management team was maintaining separate enterprise risk register, right? None of those systems were integrated and talking to each other. And so when a new data privacy regulation was announced, compliance saw it as a compliance risk. IT saw it as a security requirement they needed to implement. Legal saw it as a contract language risk, but nobody connected it to the customer experience risk that the chief marketing officer was worried about.
Yeah. So in other words, they just really can't see how one risk actually stretches across multiple domains and kind of groups within the organization.
Exactly right. In a modern integrated model, you have common risk taxonomy, a shared technology platform, and coordinated activities across all of these functions. Now, that doesn't mean everyone reports to the same person. Independence is still important, but it does mean that they're operating from the same data, using the same language, and coordinating their activities.
So you use the phrase common risk taxonomy. So maybe explain that for our listeners who aren't familiar with that.
Yeah. So what common risk taxonomy means is really, it just means that everyone categorizes and describes risks the same way. So historically, you might have IT calling something a vulnerability, while compliance calls it a regulatory gap, and risk management calls it an emerging risk. You have agreed upon definitions and categories with a common risk taxonomy. And while this sounds really simple, it's foundational because without a common language, you can't aggregate risks, you can't report consistently, and you can't make good decisions.
Singing from the same hymn book,
That's right. That's right.
And the shared platform that you highlighted, so are we talking about like GRC tools like Workiva and others like that?
That's exactly right. A modern GRC platform provides a centralized repository for your risk data, control documentation, compliance obligations, et cetera, right? It integrates with your other systems, so your ERP, your HR system, your IT security tools, so that data can flow automatically instead of being manually collected. It also will provide workflows for risk assessments, control testing, issue remediation, all with visibility and accountability.
Okay, so that integration piece does seem critical because I think one of the things we often hear from CFOs is that they feel like they're drowning in data. They feel like they've got the information, but they're still looking for good insights, right?
That's right.
So, I'm sure a lot of CFOs and, frankly, ourselves, we've got dashboards that tell us all sorts of information, but they're pulling from 10 different systems. And, oftentimes a lot of that stuff doesn't really connect with each other.
Well, and sometimes it doesn't even reconcile with each other,
that's
right?
That's fair too.
But that's exactly the problem that we're trying to solve. So a modern platform really creates a single source of truth for the organization. That way, when the CFO or audit committee asks, what are our top risks, you can answer it definitively because everyone is working from the same system. When they ask, are we compliant with this new regulation, you can show them the control mapping, you can show them the testing results, the gaps, all in one place. So what that coordination looks like in practice is this. Instead of internal audit doing their annual risk assessment, compliance doing theirs, IT security doing theirs, all at different times, asking the same business leaders the same questions, you do one comprehensive risk assessment that feeds all three functions. You get integrated reporting to the audit committee that shows how everything connects, and you have coordinated testing, so you're not testing the same thing twice.
Yeah, and I think obviously that all makes sense to me and seems like, all right, like why doesn't this happen? But I imagine there's actually more organizational dynamics that make that easier said than done. You've got different leaders who might be protective of their domains or just have different reporting lines. And I think we've seen this play out too, right? Where you've got the chief audit executive who reports to the audit committee, like we referenced earlier. You might have the CCO who's just reporting to the general counsel. The CISO reports to the chief technology officer, the chief revenue officer, maybe up to the CFO. You get my point, right? People kind of reporting in different channels and lanes here. I think everyone here, right? Obviously very smart people. They got this position at the organization, but they're incentivized, I feel like, in a way to maybe protect their own turf. And there's a legitimate concern about losing that independence that they have, especially for internal audit, right?
Sure.
If you think about just the nature of what internal audit is set out to do. So how do you make that work without compromising that independence?
Yeah, that's exactly correct. So this is where most GRC transformation efforts fail, quite frankly. It's not the technology that's the problem. It's not even the approach that's the problem. It's the organizational change.
Right.
And there's a few things that I think are important to think about here. So first, you need executive sponsorship from the CFO or chief risk officer, someone high enough up that can break down the silos and really enforce coordination across the organization. Second, you need to respect the independence where it matters, because it does matter in certain places, right? Internal audit needs to maintain its independence and its direct reporting line to the audit committee, but independence doesn't mean isolation. And internal audit can still coordinate risk assessments and share information with other groups across the organization. Third, you need to start with a clear governance structure. So who owns the risk taxonomy? Who owns the GRC platform? How do those conflicts get resolved throughout those different groups? And without a clear governance up front, you end up with the turf wars that you're describing.
Yeah, and just thinking about all these transformational changes and organizational dynamics, like imagine just change management, is hugely important here, right? You're asking people to work differently, use new tools in a lot of cases, and obviously as you're referencing, the need to collaborate in new ways.
Yes, that's exactly why we recommend really a phased approach. So don't try to transform everything all at once. Start with something tangible. So maybe you integrate the risk assessment process first, for instance, or you implement the GRC platform for one business unit, or you create integrated reporting for one key risk area. Show quick wins, build momentum, and then expand from there.
Yeah, so I think obviously great advice, very practical, right? So let's pivot a bit and talk about technology, because that's where I think a lot of organizations do struggle. I think CFOs are being asked to approve lots of technology these days, investments all over the place, new ERP systems, data analytics platforms, all the AI agents and tools out there, cybersecurity solutions, you name it. And I think there's real technology fatigue as well as, frankly, budget fatigue, right? This stuff isn't cheap. So when someone comes and says, we now need to invest in a GRC platform, I would imagine there's probably some pushback or skepticism on whether that's really necessary. Is it just another expensive system that's going to sit and not be used to its full capacity? So CFOs need help, right, understanding what technology enablement really means, I imagine, in the context of GRC modernization.
That's right.
So let me ask you, like, what role does technology play beyond just having that GRC platform in your mind?
So technology is really the enabler for everything that we've been talking about. So I'll break it down to a few key areas. I think first is the automation of the data collection. So we talked a little bit about manual data collection and kind of the burden that bears across the business. But traditionally, if you were to test a control, for instance, let's use, for example, your SOD control in your financial system.
Okay.
Some would manually pull a report, review it, and document the results. With modern tools, you can automate that. Scripts can run continuously, pulling access data, comparing it against your segregation of duties matrix, and flagging violations in real time.
So I'm guessing what that means, instead of testing quarterly or maybe even on an annual basis, you've now effectively created that continuous monitoring.
That's exactly right. Continuous controls monitoring is one of the major shifts we're seeing across GRC. So for repetitive rules-based controls, you can automate the testing and only investigate exceptions. That frees up your team to focus on judgment-based controls and higher risk areas. So one of the other areas we're seeing a lot of is workflow automation. Modern GRC platforms can automate the entire life cycle of risk and compliance activities. So a new regulation is announced, the system automatically assigns tasks to subject matter experts to assess the impact, document the controls, and update the policies. Internal audit identifies a control deficiency. The system can create a remediation plan, assign owners, track progress, and escalate if deadlines are missed. All of that happens automatically and with full visibility. So another area we're seeing a lot of is really integration and data connectivity. Modern platforms can integrate with your source systems, so your ERPs, your procurement systems, your HR system, your IT security tools. Data can flow automatically instead of being manually collected. This is a huge win for both efficiency and getting real-time visibility.
Yeah, let me ask you a little bit about SOX compliance specifically, because I think that's probably where a lot of public companies most likely feel the most pain. We hear CFOs talk about SOX as this, well, not all, but a lot do, about this necessary evil that consumes huge amounts of time and resources, especially as you think about Q3, Q4, all that testing kind of starts to ramp up and just the resources that need to be allocated to help support that. Controllers, they're pulling their hair out trying to get all that documentation pulled together from their business units who, frankly, are probably just tired of this whole process year over year. And I think the irony is that after all that work, you're really just kind of getting a point in time, right? Snapshot of whether controls that were working 6 months ago work.
Absolutely.
And by the time you finish testing and maybe even remediate any of those issues, you're already halfway through kind of the next cycle. So it seems like you're always perpetually behind. And so how does modernization actually change that common dynamic?
And not just behind, but surprised at the last minute, right?
Yes, caught off guard.
And I'm glad you brought that up, because SOX is really the perfect use case for modernization. So in your traditional model, SOX compliance is this big manual annual cycle effort. You document your controls, you test them, you fix issues, and you do it all again. It's backwards looking, and it's a burden, as you mentioned. In the modern model, SOX becomes continuous. Your key controls are monitored automatically. Deficiencies are identified and remediated as they occur, not months or quarters later during your testing cycle. Documentation is always current because it's living in the GRC platform and being maintained throughout the year. When your auditors come in, you're not scrambling to pull together evidence. It's all there.
Yeah, so you're essentially helping spread all of that heavy workload that we just talked about, the Q3, Q4 demand throughout the year instead of having that spike at the end.
That's exactly right. So you're shifting from reactive to proactive. Instead of finding out that control failed 6 months ago, you know about it immediately and you can fix it. Reduces the risk of material weaknesses. It reduces your audit fees because auditors have more comfort in your control environment. And it reduces the burden on your business units because they're not being hit with huge documentation requests all at once.
Yep.
It can't be ignored that the upfront investment there is real, right? But the ROI comes faster than people think.
Okay.
We typically see payback in 12 to 18 months, sometimes even faster. The efficiency gains are immediate. You're eliminating the manual data collection, reducing duplicate testing, and automating reporting. So a real example of this is we worked with kind of a middle market public company. They were spending around, let's say, $600K in SOX compliance effort between internal staff time, external co-sourcing fees, and audit fees. They implemented a modern GRC platform and continuous monitoring for their key financial controls. The upfront cost was around $200K for the platform, implementation, and training. But within the first year, they were able to reduce their SOX compliance cost by $100,000.
Okay.
They caught control issues faster, which meant fewer audit findings, lower external audit fees, and they were able to redeploy 2 FTEs who'd been doing manual SOX testing to do more strategic work. By year 2, they had fully recovered their investment and were saving a few $100,000 annually going forward.
Yeah, so I think that example is pretty compelling when you think about the ROA conversation. But I also imagine there were qualitative benefits too beyond just the dollar saved, right? So less audit fatigue, mentioned that term earlier, better control environment, which everyone always is striving for. And I think that's what often is underappreciated. When you reduce the friction in the compliance function, you actually improve maybe compliance outcomes at the end of the day. When business units aren't exhausted from responding to all those duplicate request examples we explained earlier, for all that manual data collection, maybe they will engage more constructively going forward. And I think controllers, when they can see control performance in real time rather than discovering issues, like you mentioned, months later, they can be more proactive and more value add. And so the efficiency gains fund themselves, if I'm thinking about that right. But the effectiveness gains, the better risk management, the fewer surprises, I think that's honestly where maybe the real value is.
Certainly. So the CFO told us in that instance that for the first time, he felt like he had real-time visibility into the control environment rather than finding out about issues months after they occurred. That peace of mind is hard to quantify, but for someone in that role, it's incredibly valuable.
All right, let me bring up the buzzword of the hour, which is AI, because it's what everyone talks about, no matter where you look, it feels like these days. So I'm sure AI is being used throughout GRC, but maybe talk a bit about like what you're seeing and how it's being used more broadly, examples of that, and then maybe even just what organizations need to be thinking about with the use of AI to help support their GRC function.
Yeah, great question. So AI is showing up in a few different ways across GRC. The first, I would say, is in risk identification. So AI can analyze vast amounts of unstructured data, whether it's news articles, social media, internal communications, to identify emerging risks that humans often miss. For example, it might detect early signals of a supplier in financial distress really before it shows up in a credit report or somewhere more tangible. So a second is in control testing. So machine learning can identify anomalies or patterns that indicate control failures or potential fraud. So instead of testing a sample of transactions, AI can analyze all transactions and flag the ones that warrant human review. 3 is in compliance monitoring. AI can read and interpret regulatory changes, map them to your existing controls, and even suggest updates. This is really valuable in heavily regulated industries where keeping up with regulatory changes is practically a full-time job. But on the other hand, AI does create new risks that GRC functions need to govern. Forward-thinking organizations are establishing AI governance frameworks, policies around how AI can be used, risk assessment processes for AI systems, controls around data quality, and model validation and mechanisms for monitoring AI performance and bias. And, one of the groups that we all know and love in the GRC space, COSO, has also come out with kind of their own framework to think about internal controls over AI.
Which is good, because I think people are moving so quickly and so rapidly with things. They may often overlook that, right? And I think that kind of pivots to my next point, which is I think this is probably one of the most challenging conversations that a lot of boardrooms are having right now. I think directors are asking those hard questions like, do we know everywhere AI is being used within the organization? Who is approving the use of the different AI tools and agents and bots and all the things out there? And what happens if our AI model, for example, makes a discriminatory decision, and whether it's hiring or in financial services, if it's a lending decision, right? Like what's the exposure or liability if something kind of goes sideways with the use of AI? And I think often management doesn't always have a good answer because, like I mentioned, it's just happening so quickly and then it's evolving so fast. And I don't think a lot of people have been able to kind of keep pace with how quickly it's been moving through a lot of organizations. And I think that is creating a lot of anxiety at the board level. They're looking to the CFO and they're probably looking to the GRC function to provide that governance and oversight. But I mean, how do you govern what you can't see?
No, that's exactly right. And kind of going back to what we were talking about earlier, this is where really that modern integrated governance structure can really help speed up decision-making and smart risks across the organization. What companies need to do is really build it into their GRC program and GRC platforms from a technology perspective. When you think about the risk taxonomy, the policies, and incorporate AI into all of those from day one. AI adoption is really only going to accelerate. You touched on it, but we're seeing it more and more across the companies that we work with. And organizations that have that governance framework in place are going to be able to move faster with more confidence and with more results than those that don't.
Yeah, and I think this is where culture is really important at an organization, right? You can have the best GRC platform in the world, but if your culture doesn't support it, probably not going to work out. So, and I think this is where most transformation efforts probably fail at companies. It's not necessarily on the technology. The technology is made to work well. It's designed to work well, but it's on that culture change that's necessary for it to be effective. And I'm sure you've seen organizations where they're spending hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars on platforms and process design, and then fast forward a couple years, people are still working around the system because the underlying behaviors maybe haven't changed. I think a question then would be like, what does a risk intelligent, if we use that phrase, culture look like? And then how do organizations actually start building towards that risk intelligent culture? Because I think that's probably the hardest part, the human change management piece.
You're absolutely right. So this is where GRC transformation either succeeds or fails. So that risk intelligent culture that you described there is one where risk management is really embedded into the decision-making process at all levels. It's not just something that the risk team does. It's not something that the C team does. It's throughout the organization. And to provide for that from a culture perspective, really what it means is that people feel empowered to speak up about risks and issues without fear of being shot as the messenger. It's where those risk conversations, they happen early in the process and not as an afterthought.
Yeah, so it's not just like, hey, risk management is the only one responsible for risk around here. And to now, like, we all have a piece of this, right? We're all a part of owning risk at this organization.
Exactly. And it still starts with tone at the top, right? Sure. The CEO and CFO need to model this behavior. When they're making strategic decisions, they need to be visibly engaged with risk management, asking good questions, and considering alternative scenarios. And when issues do arise, they need to be curious and constructive, not punitive. And that sets the tone for the entire organization.
Yeah, and I think there's often a tension here, right? I think on one hand, you want people to raise risks and concerns that they may have. On the other hand, you don't want to create that culture of complete risk aversion where people are afraid to take on any risk at all. And I think we've probably both seen the pendulum swing too far in both directions at some point, working with different organizations. And so, I think it's a hard balance, right? You have some that are so loose that they're going to get blindsided, others that are so risk adverse that they can't compete, they're not innovative. So it kind of holds people back from really getting to where they need to go. And I know we've sat in strategic planning meetings where you've heard a great idea that gets killed, not because it's necessarily a bad idea, but it's because someone raises a risk and no one knows how to have a productive conversation about it. And so it just becomes easier for people to just say no and just then try to kind of solve around that issue. So how do companies find that right balance between not being so risk adverse, but also not taking on too much risk?
It's such a critical point. So a risk intelligent culture is not risk adverse. It's risk aware is how I would describe it.
I like that.
So the goal is to make informed risk decisions, right? Not to avoid risk entirely. You want people to understand the risks they're taking, to have thought through mitigation strategies, and to have appropriate governance and oversight. But you still want them to take risks when the opportunity warrants it. One thing that really helps is to have clear risk appetite statements. So these are articulated statements that determine the types and levels of risk an organization is willing to accept in pursuit of its objectives. For example, you might have a high appetite for strategic and market risks. You're willing to take bets on new products, new services, or new markets, but a low appetite for compliance and reputational risks. When people understand the risk appetite, they can make better decisions.
Yeah, and I think that makes sense, right? I think what are some practical things organizations can do to build towards that culture?
Yeah, so I think there are a few things. First, make risk visible. When you have an integrated GRC platform and reporting, risk becomes transparent. People can see the top enterprise risks, who owns them, and what's being done about them. Transparency builds accountability and engagement. Second, integrate risk into your existing processes. Don't make risk management a separate activity. Build risk checkpoints into your strategic planning process, your project management methodology, your M&A due diligence. When risk assessment is just part of how you do business, it becomes natural. Third, train and educate your people. Most people don't have formal training in risk management. Provide practical training on how to identify and assess risks, how to use your risk framework, and how to escalate issues. Make it relevant to their specific roles. And then finally, I would say celebrate good risk management. When someone identifies a risk early and it gets mitigated, recognize that. When someone raises a concern that prevents a problem, acknowledge it. What gets celebrated gets repeated.
Yeah, and I like that last point you make, because I think in a lot of organizations, risk managers are seen as the people who say no, right, to things,
Absolutely.
which creates an adversarial dynamic if you think about it. And then you end up with possibly shadow behaviors where people maybe stop bringing ideas to risk management until the last possible moment that they have to. Or maybe they start to frame things in a weird way to avoid triggering any sort of like risk type review that might come up. That's dangerous, obviously, right? Because the risks that don't get discussed are often the ones that do materialize. So trying to avoid that. But I think we've also seen the opposite, where risk teams that are so focused on being liked and being seen as business partners that they don't push back like they should. So how do you shift the dynamic to something, I guess, more constructive in that partnership?
Yeah, so the best way to do that is really to reframe risk management as a partnership.
Okay.
So the risk team isn't there to say no. They're there to help the business say yes safely. So when a business leader comes with an initiative, the risk team's job is to help identify potential pitfalls, help develop mitigation strategies, and help figure out how to move forward with the appropriate controls in place. It's consultative, problem-solving mindset rather than a gatekeeping mindset. And frankly, this is where having a modern integrated GRC function really, really helps. When you can quickly assess risks, map out scenarios, and show comparable situations from other parts of the business or organizations, you're adding real value to the conversation. You're not slowing things down. You're helping people make better decisions faster.
Perfect. So anything we haven't touched on as it relates to GRC kind of transformation success, like anything you'd want to highlight?
Yeah, I just say that the biggest thing is really to prioritize and not try to do everything everywhere all at once. GRC transformation is a journey, not a destination. And so start with your biggest pain points, show value, build momentum. That's modernizing SOX compliance first. Maybe it's implementing a unified risk assessment process. Maybe it's standing up AI governance. Pick something that really matters to the business, do it well, and use that as a foundation to expand. And finally, I'd say don't go at it alone. GRC transformation requires real expertise in process design, change management, technology implementation, and organizational dynamics. Companies that try to do this entirely in-house, they often struggle, and it becomes kind of a sit on the shelf exercise or platform for them. Strategic partners who've done this before can accelerate the journey and help avoid those common pitfalls.
Yeah, and it's really about building that organizational resilience, right? Organizations with modern GRC capabilities are the ones that can adapt faster, respond to those crises better, capitalize on opportunities, I would imagine, more confidently. I think what we saw, especially during the pandemic, the organizations that navigated it best weren't necessarily the ones that had the most resources always, right?
Sure.
They were the ones with the best risk intelligence and the ability to make decisions quickly under uncertainty. And that capability, I don't believe, happens by accident, right? It's built through the investments that you're talking about in integrated GRC functions, the modern technology we highlighted, that risk intelligent culture example that we gave. And I argue in today's environment where disruption is constant, honestly, and the pace of change keeps accelerating, like this really isn't optional. It's almost existential.
Absolutely. In today's environment where change is constant, risks are interconnected and speed matters. GRC can't be an afterthought. It needs to be a strategic capability. And organizations that are investing in modernizing their GRC functions are really positioning themselves to thrive, not just survive.
Perfect. I think this brings us to the close of what I feel like was a fantastic conversation. I think the key takeaways for our listeners is this, if I were to summarize it, right? GRC modernization isn't optional anymore, right? We all can agree with that. If your GRC functions are still operating in silos, like we highlighted at kind of the start of the conversation, or if you're relying on manual processes and that point in time testing for almost everything, if you don't have the frameworks in place for emerging risks like AI and even climate and sustainability, we hit on it lightly, I would imagine you're falling behind. So the good news is I think there is a clear path forward, and organizations that make those investments will see the real returns that we highlighted in some of our examples. And if you're thinking about where to start, reach out to us, right? At Embark, we do help organizations assess their GRC maturity, identify gaps, build practical transformation roadmaps. And you can check us out at embarkwithus.com or connect with Allison directly. I know she'd love to carry on the conversation and answer any questions or things you would love to discuss with her. So Allison, thanks so much, as always, for joining me on this episode and for being such a strong contributor to our GRC series. I think it's been incredibly valuable for our listeners.
Thanks, Adam. It's been a pleasure.
And thanks to our listeners once again for joining us. Until next time, this is Accounting Matters.